Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, I was very surprised that the Minister, when he spoke, took so much of his speech to pat himself on the back because of this particular proposal, this particular development. He did. He spent a good part of his speech patting himself on the back as though he was entitled to take credit for it. And nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I was quite offended by his comments because this proposal has never formed any part of the government's housing plans in any respect whatsoever. And in fact, what actually happened is that the Riccarton board, the Riccarton Racecourse board, initiated the discussions, no doubt had discussions with various parties, including the Minister, and yet Joanne Hayes gets up to say to us, well, because of that, it was Nick Smith's idea. That's simply not true. It is not true. It wasn't Nick Smith's idea. He simply had to be involved because legislation was necessary. The truth is that the Riccarton Racecourse Board initiated this and then went to the City Council to develop a local bill. And I was written to, as other MPs would have been, by the City Council to prove that. And the letter is dated 9th of September 2015, and it says this, and I quote, "I write formally to notify you under clause 4.1 of Appendix C of the Standing Orders of Parliament of the intention of the Christchurch City Council to promote a local bill into Parliament called the Riccarton Racecourse Bill, the bill. The objectives of this bill are to A, identify part of Riccarton Racecourse to be available for housing development." Now, that's the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter is that it wasn't the Minister's idea at all. It was the idea that came from the Riccarton Racecourse itself. They had discussions with various parties, but it was actually the Christchurch City Council that proposed and has put this piece of legislation forward. Yes, the Minister had to get involved because the legislation was necessary, and that's why we're now looking at these two bills. But the point I do want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this, that while he was claiming inaccurately credit for this particular piece of legislation and this particular proposal for the development of that racecourse, at the same time, his government has failed to actually provide anything like an adequate plan for housing in New Zealand, nor has it done anything about immigration, which has greatly exacerbated that situation, and has only built half the houses required, especially in Auckland, and we're therefore finding people living in cars, garages, and being provided with motels at great expense to the taxpayer. And as far as Christchurch is concerned, Mr. Speaker, the reality there is the spending has come from two places. For most of the new housing that's gone up in Christchurch in recent times, one is from insurance, which is the lion's share of the funding and the projects for housing in Christchurch, and the other is EQC, which is a government fund for disaster relief and replacement of infrastructure and so on. Nothing to do with this Minister or the government's housing plans. So, Mr. Speaker, now that I've got that off my chest, I can move on to the bills themselves. And I did want to say this in particular, that New Zealand First is particularly pleased with these bills, and we want to thank the Riccarton Racecourse Board and also the Christchurch City Council for promoting the bills, because they'll make a valuable, small but valuable contribution to housing in Christchurch. And Riccarton Racecourse is a very important piece of land. In fact, it's an institution in Christchurch and in Canterbury. But the land that is required for racing will still be there, and people will still be able to enjoy that. But there's over 120 hectares, and only 40 hectares of that will actually be developed for housing. As I've said, very welcome. A relatively small but very important contribution to the need for housing in Christchurch, where new homes are certainly in demand. But there will also be a significant area of the land set aside for green open space, and that's also very important. So you get three advantages: the retention of the racecourse, the new housing, and some open space. So given that, it's a pretty positive proposal and a very positive development. And the key purpose of these bills is to provide for both affordable and market housing in Christchurch, and those that are to be set aside for affordable housing, the price is to be a base of $450,000. That is affordable in today's markets, and that is going to be very welcome indeed. And of those 600 homes, 30% will be targeted to be in the affordable home category. Now, as I've said in previous speeches on this, New Zealand First would have liked to have seen that at 50% as a minimum. But having said that, 30% is still a valuable contribution and is entirely supportable as far as we are concerned. And the methodology that is to be is that the Riccarton Racecourse Board will provide a development scheme meeting all of the minimum specified requirements in the bills, and that will be submitted to the Minister for final approval. So it will mean at least 180 affordable homes, and they will be very, very welcome in Christchurch City. I also wanted to say this, Mr. Speaker, about that situation in Christchurch, because immediately after the initial earthquakes in 2010 and especially 2011, there was an exodus of people away from Christchurch. In fact, 16,600 people left people in those years immediately after the worst of the earthquakes occurred, simply because their houses had been damaged or were red zoned, were uninhabitable, and there weren't enough houses for all of the people in Christchurch to live in. So it's no surprise that that number of people left. That situation in more recent years has been reversed, and we're still seeing about 5,000 people per year increase in the Christchurch population. And that's because, as I said, of the effect of the investment from insurance monies and from EQC in building homes. Very little of any of that was actually due to any government policy as far as housing development is concerned. So it's most inappropriate that the government should use these bills, to say that they have done such a wonderful job. The opposite is the case. The government has done next to nothing. In fact, after the earthquakes, they even refused to put a cap on rents, so they skyrocketed. And yet Scott Simpson had the temerity to tell us in this House a few minutes ago that in recent years there had been a 5% reduction in rents. Well, big deal, because before that there had been years and years of huge increases in rents because the government didn't do anything about it. That's right. And that's the truth of that situation, Mr. Simpson. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say this, that the influx of people now beginning to occur in Christchurch and actually in other places is driven not only by the history that I've just outlined, but also as a result of government inaction of housing, about housing across the country, especially, of course, in Auckland, because of the chronic housing crisis which has now developed there because of the utter mess that this government has made about housing policy in New Zealand. So these houses spoken of in these bills are needed, but many, many more will be needed as well because of the flight from Auckland, because of house prices there, and because of the whole situation concerning the deficit of houses in New Zealand, and especially because of the gross neglect by this government, not only of housing development, but also of social housing in New Zealand. So with those facts specifically in mind, it's very important that somebody does something about housing in this country, and this small but important project will make a contribution which is valued. It'll be valued by Christchurch people and is certainly valued by New Zealand First. So for that reason, we will have no hesitation in supporting these bills.